Hi, good evening, Lisa. Can we do an audio test? Make sure your audio is working.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, now we can. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Okay, it looks like it's 6 o'clock. It's the start time for this community workshop. I would like to thank everyone for taking the time this evening to join us for the third community workshop as part of the housing element update process. We will be doing a presentation tonight on affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a new component of the housing element process. It hasn't been any previous versions of it. We will be getting started here shortly. I would like to turn it over to Xenia real quickly, who will go over some participation notes for this evening.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. I have a PowerPoint here to share. Perfect. So for members of the public who wish to participate by phone, you can do so by dialing 669-900-6833. At the prompt, you can enter the meeting ID 884-5188-3836. You can press pound, and during public participation, press *9 to speak. Additionally, tonight's meeting will have live Spanish interpretation. To access the interpretation, you will need to use the Zoom application from either your cell phone, tablet, or computer. Once you join the meeting from the Zoom application, you will see a small globe at the bottom or top of the screen. You can click the globe and you'll be able to access the live interpretation. We have Julie and Francisco as our interpreters this evening. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much, Xenia. Okay, with that, we will turn it over to our consulting team of Rincon and Mintier Harnish, who will present this evening's topic.
Thanks, Aaron. I think Ryan, the other Ryan on the meeting tonight, is going to share his screen. All right, perfect. So like Aaron said, tonight's meeting really is to go over the affirmatively furthering fair housing component of the housing element update. I'm going to be just calling that AFFH throughout the workshop. It's a little bit tricky to say. So, but this is the third public workshop, and we're really just wanting to get some insight and feedback from the community on fair housing issues in the city. If you can go to the next slide. So the slide shows the project team. My name's Ryan. I'm with Rincon Consultants. I'm joined here with Ryan Lester and Jim Harnish with Mintier Harnish. And we also have Lisa Siegel here with Rincon Consultants as well. She's an associate planner there. Next slide. So this just shows a general agenda for tonight. I'm going to go briefly over the housing element process for those of you who might not have attended the previous workshops, and then really dive into the state's newest requirement for AFFH. And then I'm going to go over each of the required categories for AFFH. So those are listed here: enforcement and outreach, integration and segregation, concentrated areas of poverty, access to opportunity, and disproportionate housing need. And then I'm going to go over some of the next steps in the housing element process. All right, next slide. So this might be a repeat of information for some of you, but the housing element, it's a state mandated part of the general plan. It's required to be updated every 8 years. And really it provides an assessment for both the current and future housing need. It also looks at opportunities and constraints for the production of housing, and those can be market or governmental constraints. It then establishes goals and programs in order to meet the city's housing needs and to reflect new state guidance or laws. And within the housing element, typically within the needs and constraints analysis is this new AFFH component. And throughout the housing element process, public participation is critical, but specifically for fair housing, we tend to look at regional data and census data. So it's good to get community insight on, fair housing issues that are appearing within specific neighborhoods and on the ground. All right, next slide. So AFFH, next slide. So last year in 2021, the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, they provided a good guidance document for how local governments should analyze local and regional fair housing conditions in order to affirmatively further fair housing. Essentially, they want cities to take meaningful actions to address fair housing during this housing cycle. Essentially, the AFFH analysis is intended to gather data and establish programs in order to combat either previous housing discrimination, to eliminate racial bias, undo historic patterns and trends of segregation, and to lift barriers that restrict access to housing for some population groups. But ultimately, the purpose of this is to foster a more inclusive community where all sections of the population have fair access to housing. Next slide. So this just goes over some of the legislative origins of fair housing. I'll just briefly go over it. So the Fair Housing Act, enacted in the 1960s, really started the prohibition of discrimination related to housing. More recently, in California, Assembly Bill 686 expanded upon fair housing requirements in California, including protections, and it requires this new cycle of housing elements to include an analysis and provide meaningful actions to address fair housing. And then last year, HCD released some guidance on how cities can best do this. Next slide. So this new AB 686 bill that was released, it requires housing elements to have some components related to fair housing. So there needs to be sufficient outreach, especially to impacted community groups. It needs to include a full assessment of fair housing. It needs to make sure that the site inventory in the housing element isn't making conditions worse. And then it really needs to provide actions and programs in the housing element to address whatever the main fair housing issues are in the city. Next slide. So these are the 5 main categories of fair housing that the housing element is going to analyze. Typically, the type of information, so for each of these categories, I'm going to go over, I'm going to include what the type of information is in the analysis. I'm going to include some preliminary results. We're still going through the process, but in order to start some discussion, I'll include some preliminary results from some of the early analysis. I'll then explain some typical actions and programs that could address these fair housing issues. And then we'll open it up to discussion. And so, like you heard in the discussion, you can either raise your hand or add a comment in the feature, or if you called in by phone, you can press *9. So if you can go to the next slide. So the first category in AFFH that we'll analyze is fair housing enforcement and outreach. And really this category looks into whether the city conducts adequate outreach and education so that the community in St. Helena are aware of their housing rights. The analysis will also look at the city's ability to address compliance with fair housing laws. So it'll include a discussion of any current lawsuits, enforcement actions, settlements, or other fair housing issues that have occurred. So essentially this topic really is to determine if residents really feel informed of their housing rights know where they can go if they have a problem, and looks at the city's track record for fair housing issues. So the city currently contracts with the nonprofit organization Fair Housing Napa Valley, and they assist residents with fair housing counseling services, connections to rental assistance, homelessness prevention programs, and they conduct fair housing testing. So within the previous 8 years, there have been no fair housing inquiries in the city, but that's not to say that there haven't been fair housing issues that have come up. If you can go to the next slide. So this slide shows of some meaningful actions that the city or other cities could take to address fair housing enforcement and outreach. You can conduct more outreach and education events to the public in order to receive input and feedback on fair housing issues that the public has seen, and also to improve the information that residents have in order to access resources if they need to. The city could meet regularly with Fair Housing Napa Valley to discuss issues and trends in the region and identify options to address those issues. The city can increase enforcement by identifying either units not in compliance, maybe units that are illegal or overcrowded or unmaintained, that the tenants are really living in substandard conditions, which would be a fair housing issue. So those are a few meaningful actions just related to enforcement and outreach. But I wanted to open it up to discussion now. I have a couple questions here on the PowerPoint to start the conversation, but if there is anything else related to fair housing enforcement and outreach, feel free to raise your hand or leave a comment. But how can the city eliminate or prevent discriminatory housing practices? How do you think? And what are some ways the city can make sure residents are more informed of their housing rights? So making sure renters aren't getting kicked out of their rental unit too quick, or a single parent isn't being turned away, maybe because they have a child. So those are just some discussion points. If anyone has any comments or wants to bring anything up.
I'm not seeing anything at this time, Ryan.
Okay. That's fine. I mean, it's a pretty broad category, and at the end of this presentation, we'll give some links and information on how you can, if something does come to mind related to enforcement or outreach that you think the city can improve on, you can always leave a comment after this meeting tonight. And if we have time, we can come back to this topic as well. But I guess we can move on maybe to the next topic, which I think is segregation. Okay, yeah. So the next main topic in AFFH that we're going to look at is integration segregation, patterns and trends. So this requires, looking at some regional data and census data to see if there's any patterns of segregation in the city. And segregation could be related to race or ethnicity. It could be related to disability, familial status. So is an area of the city are there single parents concentrated in a certain area of the city? Is there segregation based off of income? Those types of things will be looked at in this section. If you can go to the next slide. So we do have some preliminary mapping results. It's probably pretty hard to see the legend, so I'll explain it a bit for you. But this slide shows the percent non-white population within the city. So the lighter green has a lower non-white population, and the darker green and the blue area has a higher non-white population, so more diverse. So essentially the southern southeastern area of the city is more diverse within that census block. So this data is based off of a census block group. If you can go to the next slide.
Oh, hey, Ryan, could you just comment real quick about this data and how the appendage there to the east, going up the hill there, why it's also grouped in?
Yeah, so this data is really, like I said, based off of census block. So it takes into consideration all of the residents that are in that area. And it's really based off of census data. There could be a fair number of people residing in that area. Ryan, if you can go to the next slide. Actually, I think median income is the right slide. So for instance, in that area, which is light purple, that is showing really a lower median income. So lighter the purple, the lower the income category. Because it's based off a block group, though, it takes into consideration all of the whole population in that area. So there are, a number of residents in that area that could have a high median income. But what are some things on the ground that might be contributing to that? From my experience with the city, there's a number of older adult facilities in that area. There's some mobile home parks in that area. So those are some things that can be contributing to these patterns. But generally, this map is showing, the eastern side of the city generally has a, excuse me, a lower median income. Next slide. And this shows the percentage of the population that have a low or moderate income. So the red means that less of the population in that area are considered low or moderate. So essentially they have a higher income. So this map is consistent with the previous figure. So the northern and the western areas of the city, at least based off of the census data, is showing to be higher income, whereas the southeastern area of the city is shown to be more lower income. You can go to the next slide. And so part of the discussion really is to ask you, is that the case? Is that what we're seeing? And if so, what can we do to address that issue? Here are some meaningful actions that the city could take to solve that. Promote development of affordable housing throughout the city and not just in certain areas. Whether that's using the inclusionary housing ordinance or providing incentives for developers to build housing in a certain area. Encouraging landlords in high resource areas to market their rental units to lower income residents. And then really just encouraging the development of ADUs that are actually rented out or more types of housing besides single family housing. Especially in areas that are higher income. And so opening it up to discussion again, I wanted to see, do you think these trends that those maps show are correct? Are there certain areas in the city that, have higher concentration of lower income people or those with more affluence? And then do you have any ideas for how to better integrate the populations besides some of the ones that I just mentioned?
At the moment, I do not see any hands raised from the list of attendees.
Okay.
Yeah, we can move on.
Okay, sounds good. So next, so disparities in access to opportunities. So this is the fourth category of fair housing issues we're going to look at. It requires, again, collecting regional data analyzing local and regional reports to identify barriers to accessing housing. And so barriers could be education, employment, transportation, a healthy environment. So are there certain areas of the city that have more environmental issues? Are there certain areas of the city that have a difficult time accessing good education? Just some preliminary analysis results. There doesn't seem to be any disparities in the city, and this is just based off of regional data. There doesn't seem to be disparities related to transit or walkability between neighborhoods. Obviously along Main Street, those are the more walkable and transit friendly areas, but between neighborhoods and block groups, there's really no specific trends. And then the entire city has a pretty a good access to educational opportunities. The southern and southeastern portions of the city tend to have less access to jobs and more environmental issues. And again, this is based off of census block data. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is showing the TCAC map, which is the Tax Credit Allocation Committee opportunity map. And so these maps, they're made in collaboration with HCD and the Tax Credit Allocation Committee. And they take a number of factors into account when they determine whether an area is high resource or low resource. And those are economic indicators, environmental indicators, education, poverty and segregation. So as you can see, the western area of the city is considered high and highest resource, whereas the eastern is considered moderate and low resource. If you can go to the next slide. So some meaningful actions that could be taken to address some of these disparities in access, targeting investment in areas in need. So is an area having environmental issues based off of a certain use there, or some other factors that the city can target investment in? Really, it's just targeting and developing affordable housing in areas with high resources, and then encouraging mixed use and mixed income development in non-residential zones. So those are some actions that the city can include in the housing elements to try and address these issues. But opening it up to discussion again, these are just some talking point questions, but do you think there are any populations or neighborhoods that have disparities in accessing some of these things? Education, job, or transit? Are there any areas in the city that you think have more environmental issues that could impact those living there more than other portions of the city? And any ideas for improving access? And then that's access to, education, jobs, and that sort of thing.
Any members of the public who wish to participate can raise their hand now. Okay, Ryan, I have Steve Goldfarb who has their hand raised. One moment, Mr. Goldfarb. Okay, go ahead. You can speak now.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes,
Yep.
we can.
I get a little confused by sort of the categories which are discussed here, because it does seem to me that you were right about the area, those areas that have more resources compared to those that don't. But part of that is because within the city, there are areas which are designated agricultural for the most part. And so they clearly have different requirements because they involve a lot of land in order to make those happen. And I think the issues of whether there's access to these resources throughout the city, I think the answer is that it is, but what's missing in this community is just the number of housing units and the sheer number. And checking in with residents to ask them if they have some problems, which apparently from the very beginning, the data you have say for people that live here, there's not a lot of concern for the quality of the housing that is here. The issue is, how do we get more people to be able to live in the city, especially people who work in this area, and to generate more housing, not necessarily improving the housing that's here.
Thanks, Steve. I would agree with that.
If I could also just add in, I think that that's one of the big things that, as we talk about meaningful actions, that HCD wants to see. They really want to see you not just putting housing in areas that are struggling, but that you're putting it in high resource areas. So coming up with ways to increase the number of housing units in high resource areas is a big part of what we need to do for AFFH.
Anyone else?
No. Okay, we can move on.
Okay, and so the fifth category of AFFH that we're going to look at is disproportionate housing need. So it looks at if certain segments of the population are experiencing a type of housing issue more than another member of another group. So we'll look at overpayment and cost burden when finding new housing. We'll look at if there's overcrowding in housing. So if people are crowding into a housing unit in order to make it more affordable. We'll look at substandard housing conditions like Steve just mentioned, homelessness and displacement risk. And so preliminarily, the preliminary analysis, like Steve said, St. Helena does not really have a substandard housing issue or a big displacement risk. So those are just some of the preliminary results that we've been seeing. So if you can go to the next slide. So this slide shows maps for homeowners and renters and the percentage of them that are overpaying. And overpaying means they're paying over 30% of their household income. So for the homeowners, the darker the green, the more percentage of the population is overpaying for their housing. So the southern area of the city is generally, so that's 40 to 60% is overpaying on their housing compared to the northern, which is showing about 20 to 40. And then renters pretty much throughout the city, about 40 to 60% are overpaying for housing, and this is obviously a common trend throughout California. Housing prices are expensive. A lot of people are overpaying, but this is showing that renters throughout the city are maybe paying a bit more throughout. We can go to the next slide. So some meaningful actions to address some of these issues is diversify and expand the housing stock. So having more ADUs, more duplexes, triplexes instead of single family houses. Provide rehabilitation assistance if there is a substandard housing issue. And then, going back to diversifying and expanding the housing stock, that helps alleviate overcrowding issues. If someone could find an accessory dwelling unit, maybe that they could live in, that might be a little bit more affordable than a full single family house. So these are just some potential ideas for actions to address these issues. So to go back into discussion, here are just a few talking points, but really if there's anything else that you want to bring up, feel free. Do you think there's any areas of the city that might be overcrowded or have substandard housing issues compared to others? Do you have any additional policy recommendations in order to, create a more stable housing supply within the city?
I see a hand up. Mr. Joe McGrath. I will allow you to speak. Go ahead, Mr. McGrath. I believe you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So we've mentioned ADUs a couple times. It's not clear to me that we have evidence that ADUs, while the intent was in the right place, when the state enacted the sort of streamlining for ADUs, it's not clear to me that we have local evidence that has played any impact whatsoever in accommodating affordability. Do we have any evidence that the ADUs that have been streamlined through that process are being put out onto the market for lease or rentals? Because we shouldn't point to something as a solution unless it's actually solving a problem.
Well, I can take a quick stab at that. Well, one, no, you're correct. We haven't seen any evidence of that. I think what Ryan is trying to get us to is, if the city can come up with policies to promote the renting out of ADUs, to incentivize them in some way. And Ryan,
yeah, I mean, it seems to me we've got to go back and change the state law to say if you want the streamlining. If you want the streamlining that you get with ADUs, then there's some sort of reciprocal commitment that you're making with those. Otherwise, go through a normal approval process.
Yeah.
I will say we've heard similar comments in other communities as well. I know it's frustrating.
Thank you.
Any other member in the public? Okay. We have Ms. Jennifer Ledley Bertie. Go ahead.
Good evening. Just to respond to the ADU matter, I know the staff is aware that the city of Napa has a program where it provides technical assistance and funding to people who are willing to restrict the rents on their ADUs. So I think that's a program. I mean, the infrastructure is in place. It's been modified and streamlined, and it seems like that's something that St. Helena should consider replicating. And you also have a contract with the Housing Authority, and I believe they would be able to provide some staff assistance for that.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I also have a question, if I may. Is the analysis going to show households actually leaving St. Helena because they can't afford to live there anymore? Will it capture any of that data? Because we're trying to understand it better.
It'll have some analysis of displacement risk,
Okay.
but I'm not sure. We can get a little bit more specific if in our analysis, if that's something you'd like to see. Is there a certain trend you've seen in the region?
Well, I mean, I think that there's older data that suggests that a significant percentage of households moved out of the area because, they can't afford to live there. And so if those are working families and people whose kids are attending the local schools, and, that has a significant impact on the health of the community. And it just seems like that would be important to really wrap our arms around. I mean, it suggests to some degree that in addition to low income housing, that the city should take some action to create policies that facilitate more middle income housing as well. Whether that's creating some kind of incentive or for maybe deed restricting at higher income levels. Something along that line.
And you're thinking that in order to try and keep existing residents in the city?
Yes, I believe, it appears that the problem doesn't only apply to people in lower income levels, but also people who are making over, households that are making over 250,000 a year are having trouble affording to live in St. Helena. And those are, the future of the community, those households.
Thank you, Jennifer. Anybody else? No. Okay. We can move on.
I think the next couple slides is really just opening it back up. Generally, if anyone, from any of the previous topics or, really anything related to the housing element update, ideally we would focus on fair housing issues. But I believe we have some time.
Any members of the public wish to provide any feedback?
We do appreciate the feedback we've received so far. Very, very helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Ryan, I do not see any hands up.
Okay.
So this slide really is just a reminder. If you think of any actions that you think would be good to address fair housing conditions or have any questions or comments, the city has a housing element update website. The link is here, but if you just Google St. Helena housing element update, it comes right up. And there is a comment feature. So we'd greatly appreciate any comments or ideas related to fair housing or anything related to the housing element update. And then
I'm sorry, Ryan, I don't mean to interrupt. We do have one hand raised. It's Mr. Steve Goldfarb. Would you like me to have him speak?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to add one thing. It's something that I didn't see here is being covered. One of the big problems in this town is the cost of housing. And it's going to be difficult to get the private marketplace to build housing in this community if they can't get enough money for it to pay the bills. And one of the best ways that we have found, not just here, but in many places, is to have much more public financing involved to provide housing, which would then be restricted so that prices wouldn't go up and people wouldn't have to worry about where they lived once they were here. Is there going to be any analysis of the kind of money we think, like maybe the city would have to raise to be used for either loans or grants to people who are willing to build affordable housing and still get a fair return on their money?
Not necessarily part of the AFFH analysis per se, but as part of the city's goals and programs and policies in order to, construct all of the lower income units that the city's required to over the next 8 years. That's certainly something that we can look into, partnerships that the city can take, incentives that the city can provide, more incentives like density bonuses. Maybe the current density bonus isn't penciling out. Maybe there needs to be more incentives provided. So those are some of the things that we'll look into.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there's no additional hands raised.
So this just shows some of the next steps, and Aaron and Ryan, Lester, feel free to add any, but the next step is we're going to wrap up the draft AFFH analysis, and in that we'll coordinate with the Napa Sonoma Collaborative on AFFH. And then really we're going to be getting a draft housing element out for public review in the next couple months. So there'll be multiple rounds of review, potential for updates and edits to the housing element. So keep an eye out for that. Again, if you join the email list, you'll get all the notifications.
Ryan, we have Mr. Joe McGrath who raised his hand.
Okay.
Yeah, I've mentioned this, I think maybe to Aaron and to Maya a couple times, but one thing that I look at, when I'm sort of evaluating whether there's opportunity on various parcels, I'm not sure you guys are completely aware of it or not, but in the medium density residential, my understanding is that there's not you can't build more apartment complexes in medium density unless they are specifically identified as a housing opportunity site. You can build duplexes, you can build triplexes, but for example, you couldn't build a fourplex. Now, of course, you can go through a discretionary process to get a conditional use permit to do that, but every time you have, non-ministerial approval, you end up getting, not only do you have the snags of having to go through a discretionary process, but you also potentially trigger CEQA type overview. And so that's something to me that is a really, really tactical zoning code. So we do have this process today. It seems that if you promote it to housing opportunity site and it's still MDR, then yeah, you can build apartment complexes. But if it's not, you have to go through a conditional use. And that just seems like a snag for smaller lots. And I don't know why we would distinguish between a triplex and a fourplex, for example. And those are just really tactical things that, sort of sway a financial equation, left or right.
Yeah.
Thank you for the comment.
That's a really good point. And it is something that, we have looked into, different permitted by rights, different housing types and different zones. So yeah, we appreciate that comment.
Anybody else? I'm not seeing anything. Xenia, doesn't look like you are either. All right, well, that concludes our workshop for the evening. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know everybody has families and work and other things that are trying to get their attention. And so we understand how valuable it is for you to take the time to do this. So we very much appreciate it. We look forward to hearing from you and seeing you as we continue to move forward through this process. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.